Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Hi everyone, thanks for coming to our second divestment live stream of the day. The first divestment live stream was focused on the idea of Divestment 101, kind of giving people an introduction to divestment. And then we had a talk from Gracie Brett from DivestEd, and she kind of talked on what DivestEd's role played in organizing university campuses for divestment. Before we get started, I'm going to put into the chat a quick sign-in sheet. If you guys could take a minute and just fill that out for us, that would be great. Also, before we get started with the presentations, we just want to point people's attentions to Mutual Aid Worcester and Mass Redistribution Fund. Mass Mutual Aid Worcester is a place for Worcester folks to identify community needs and develop community solutions to respond to those needs. On their Facebook page, you can sign up to help. You can indicate if you need help, and if you're able, you can donate via Venmo. Also, you could think about donating to Mass Redistribution Fund, which works with 10 different grassroots groups across Mass, providing relief to Massachusetts' most vulnerable. Thank you guys again for being on. With that, we're going to get started. First up, we have, just an introduction to this stream. This stream is going to be more focused on actual divestment campaigns that have or are happening in our community, whereas the first one was kind of an introduction to the topic. This is the topic in action. And then we're going to end with a presentation from the Union of Concerned Scientists on fossil fuel disinformation campaigns as well as targeted divestment. So with that, we're going to hop into the presentations. The first up is Clark Climate Justice. Clark Climate Justice is a student-led group committed to intersectional climate justice initiatives at Clark University. Clark Climate Justice is dedicated to advancing the cause of peace and justice on the personal, community, and policy levels through the skill building, collaboration with local organizations in the Maine South community, advocacy, and education. Two members, Emily Braddock and Adeline Hebert, are a part of the call tonight to represent the organization's divestment work and their future campaigns. So with that, I turn it to you guys. Thank you again for being on.
Hi, thank you so much for having us. So I'm Adeline and my fabulous friend Emily is here with us. I'm a first-year student at Clark and Emily is a sophomore. So some of the information about our divestment campaign is from a little bit before our time, but we're here to give you a great overview of what we've been working on. Emily, do you want to take it?
Thanks, Adeline. So if folks were on the call earlier today from 12 to 1, you probably heard a little bit of an overview of what is divestment. But just really quick, if folks don't know, divestment is when an institution pulls out their monetary investments in industries such as coal, oil, and gas. And a lot of times institutions tend to divest from the top 200 fossil fuel companies, otherwise known as the Carbon Underground 200. And this is a lovely photo up here over to the right of some folks in our group who got to meet some students also running a divestment campaign called DivestPit. And Adeline will take us away here.
Yeah, so in 2016, about 4 years ago, Clark students launched our divestment campaign. That year, they drafted a proposal to Clark's Board of Trustees asking the school to divest on the grounds of immoral investment. There were lots of rallies and different flyering events that were super exciting for students on campus. In 2016, after the group had submitted a huge proposal, very in-depth, that the Board of Trustees asked for, the board actually said fossil fuels are not immoral because places like hospitals that save people's lives actually need fossil fuels to do their work. We obviously didn't quite agree with that. The Board of Trustees in this letter also pointed out that at Clark, we don't have any direct investments in the fossil fuel industry, meaning that we only have indirect investments through things like mutual funds. Emily, can you bring us to the next slide, please?
Yeah, sorry.
You're all good, you're all good. And some insights that we learned from this, this half of our campaign is that it's critical to know the specifics of your institution. So we didn't know originally that Clark only had indirect investments, so it doesn't quite make as much sense for us to do a divestment campaign. And we also learned that it's super crucial to be connected to your community to understand the nuanced details. Additionally, we learned to be really wary of bureaucratic processes and runarounds. The board had originally asked for this really in-depth documentation and research, but we feel a little bit like that wasn't really productive in the full scheme of things since they ended up turning it down.
So basically, after we received like the rejection about divestment, some students pivoted more towards reinvestment for fall 2018. So saying like, you know, if Clark's not actually going to agree to pull out indirect investments or that's too complicated, like maybe it makes more sense to see if we can move funds that we already have and reinvest those in productive ways in the Worcester community. But that wasn't really resonating with campus either. So in spring 2019, the students running the divestment group sort of pivoted back towards divestment. We had a couple of students actually do the Divest Ed Fellowship. And so by fall 2018, which is fall 2019, when Adeline and I actually came on, people were excited to move back towards divestment, and we actually had a lot of like momentum building on campus and had like a divestment town hall where we brought a bunch of students in and also faculty, and we were having sort of like a campus-wide discussion about divestment. But ultimately, you know, we were trying to make this more symbolic ask where we were like, Clark, since you don't have like direct investments in the fossil fuel industry, could you make a statement, sort of a political statement saying that you don't have direct investments in the fossil fuel industry, and that just wasn't resonating with our campus at all. So we've sort of moved on a bit from that. If we could do the next slide. Yeah, so basically from this whole process though, like one thing that we've learned is that it can be really challenging, you know, to build student power when students only come in and they're here for 4 years and, you know, they might study abroad 1 year. But like through this, even though there's been sort of ups and downs with divestment and it's ultimately like not really working out for the logistics of our institution, it's still a really, really powerful way to train student organizers and build community. And you can see the picture in the right-hand corner. That's most of our divestment group, fall 2019. And it's just been a really great way to build skills. Yeah.
Yeah, and something else that we learned through this entire project has been that divestment is a very powerful symbolic action, and it doesn't have anything really, really concrete and connected to the community. But it can also be even more powerful if you build student power, community, and student leaders. And the way we've kind of moved towards doing this in the past few years is by having community potlucks and very community-oriented events, in addition to also building symbolic action and also building towards a goal of divestment. Additionally, we learned that it is absolutely crucial to build solidarity with other justice groups. A couple of years ago, the Clark Climate Justice was actually called out for being a too white space and for not showing up for racial justice groups in the same way that CCJ had been showing up for divestment. And this was very, very critical to learn and even like kind of stigmatize the group for a little while as being a white space.
So basically, as we've sort of reassessed our divestment campaign and moved away from divestment, we've been able to get involved in a lot of really exciting things this semester particularly. So we've gotten involved with direct actions, actually last semester, some direct actions around blocking trains in Worcester. We've gotten involved with the fight over the Weymouth compressor station being built. This spring, some of us traveled to Pennsylvania to learn from a really great organization working for coal mining justice and fighting against fracking. And we've been recently working on trying to develop a natural gas campaign so that Clark can fight for more energy justice in the Worcester community. And I think basically moving forward, like we've realized Clark has a really unique positionality in the Main South neighborhood. Like we're not a huge institution. We don't have nearly as many funds indirectly invested in the fossil fuel industry as say like Harvard. And so we realized that maybe it makes more sense rather than doing like a symbolic ask of divestment to actually focus Clark's resources on doing something concrete in Main South, because we do have more connections through like a community development organization. But yeah, we're having a lot of fun learning a ton of things from all of these actions we've been able to do. We're still building student power. And I think we're both really excited to see, and our whole club is really excited to see where we can go next from here.
Awesome. Thank you both very much. I think it touches upon an important topic that we kind of talked about in the first live stream where, sometimes you might face difficulties when you're having a divestment campaign, but just because it's not going where you want it to go does not mean it was not successful, because at the same time, you are building those organizing skills, you're forming relationships, and you're also setting the groundwork for those that come after you or different universities in the area that are still pushing for divestment. They can kind of see the process that you went through and learn from, what worked with you, what did not work with you, and go from there. So thank you both very much. Up next, we have Emma Powell, who's going to be giving a talk. She is from Holy Cross. She's a senior and the sustainability director for the student government at Holy Cross. She has worked on a variety of projects this year, including hiring a full-time sustainability director, a green fund, and composting in the residencies. Previously, she served as the marketing and outreach facilitator on HC Fossil Free, Holy Cross's divestment campaign. After a bit of a hiatus, she is working to reestablish the campaign and turn it over to rising leaders on her campus. So with that, we turn it to Emma. Thank you again for giving this presentation.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. That was really great to hear some of Clark's struggles with divestment, as well as just kind of hearing a history of their divestment campaign, because I found a lot of similarities in kind of the work that we did. Just to start off, I wanted to talk a little bit about Holy Cross's endowment, because I think it's really important to understand your institution's endowment in order to understand kind of divestment steps. So at any given moment, around 8 to 10% of the Holy Cross endowment is exposed to investments in fossil fuel industries. And very similar to Clark, it's really hard to argue for divestment just because of this idea of indirect versus direct funds. Holy Cross doesn't have any direct funds in fossil fuels, but it does have about 10% in their indirect holdings and things like mutual funds. And we often would get a lot of pushback when we were working on the campaign that it would involve hiring a new hedge fund manager and really kind of changing the structure of our institution in order to divest. So I think before you start a divestment campaign, it's really important to understand sort of your endowment. And we have a large endowment, one of the largest in Worcester. It's $681 million. And so you can imagine about 10% of that would be quite a lot of money. So I just I was doing some research and I found this chart. So this just kind of shows you where Holy Cross racks up in terms of endowment growth with other institutions in Worcester. And I think it's just a reminder that if we were all to divest, that would make a really large impact within the Worcester community to just show how much money we would be able to divest, and of course like a moral statement. So you can see that Holy Cross, WPI, and Clark are the top 3 schools with in terms of their endowments. So just to give you some sort of structural understanding of HC Fossil Free, Marie Charlton, who presented earlier, was the founder of HC Fossil Free, and it grew out of our larger group, Eco Action, which is still fully functioning now. It's very similar to Clark Climate Justice, and it has a range of different goals. HC Fossil Free was a smaller scale campaign within that larger group. And it has gone on a bit of a hiatus, but I think this is important to recognize that if you have multiple groups on campus, you can create campaigns or subcommittees within that larger group to focus more on maybe this nitty-gritty research work that it takes for divestment. So something that I really wanted to emphasize is that with our college mission statement, we were really able to kind of use a lot of the moral arguments. Holy Cross is a Jesuit institution, so it's a little different than some of the other schools in Worcester, but we all have sort of this mission statement that our colleges release. In particular, Holy Cross is a faith-based institution, so there's a lot of different pillars of support working in society, and religion and education are both part of that pillar. So we are able to kind of tap into both of those different arguments, which I thought kind of made our campaign a little bit interesting because we're able to make a lot of moral arguments using our mission statement. And so this is just all to kind of say, like, tap into like what your school cares about and understanding your institution, kind of like Clark was talking about. We are able to tap into the fact that we are a Jesuit school, and Catholicism preaches a lot about social justice, and that's obviously really related to climate justice. So we can use things like Pope Francis's encyclicals and preferences from the Jesuit institution hierarchy to kind of be like, hey, our hierarchy is calling for this, so why aren't you doing anything about it? So just to kind of give a really quick history of HC Fossil Free, back in April 2015, Marie-Therese kind of came up with the idea of having a divestment campaign on Holy Cross campus, and she met Bill McKibben and he signed a book for her, and that kind of inspired the movement a bit. And then she kind of just started by having conversations and getting to know our institution better. She met with stakeholders around campus. It's really important to kind of tap into all these different networks because people in economic majors might be really interested in divestment. So find those people who are interested in the nitty-gritty research, as well as people who are extroverted and can do marketing. Marketing and social media was always my favorite part of the campaign and something that I would focus on. So you kind of need a range of people that can tap into different groups in terms of organizing. And so then we started around education. The first thing that we did was had just like a fishbowl to kind of get people's feelings around divestment. And I think that's worth doing every few years if your campaign goes on a hiatus. And then we restructured our groups and began to formalize sort of a core group around that. And then in winter 2016, we kind of started to write our own proposal. And we finally presented that in February of 2018. Sorry, I'm just having trouble clicking through these. And our proposal, much like Clark, is a really, really detailed proposal. These are kind of the three major takeaways, and we asked for complete divestment from the top 200 coal, oil, and gas companies. We asked for a documentation of the divestment process, which I think is really important, that you get transparency from your institution to make sure that they're upholding your demands. And then a reinvestment of a small portion of divested fund into democratic energy projects local to the Worcester community. So making sure that you're giving back to the Worcester community on a larger scale. And so that proposal went through in 2018. Nothing really came from it. Similar to Clark, we kind of got a lot of pushback. We weren't really sure what to do next. Turnover was a huge issue for us. I studied abroad, Marie-Therese graduated, and so just finding underclassmen who are really passionate around a campaign is really important, because if you don't have somebody to take over the work that you've done, and a lot of times it kind of just either dies or goes on a hiatus. So right now what I'm trying to do, especially given the opportunity of COVID-19, like not the opportunity, but being home, I've been trying to mobilize some underclassmen to sort of take over the campaign and see what they want to do, and totally leaving it up to them. And so right now we're kind of in the process of reestablishing goals and if we want to pursue divestment again. I definitely think that a lot of the problems that we faced have echoed Clark universities. And yeah, so that's it.
Awesome, thank you again. I think that's also a common theme that a lot of university divestment groups face, is there is a high turnover, and with that, there may be a turnover with people's passion in regards to like pursuing divestment from their university. So that is one of the biggest challenges that I've seen with university groups. So with that, we're gonna push away from the actual university groups, and we're gonna look at a letter that WPI has sent to their president and board of trustees, kind of opening the door of communication between their group and the administration, as well as asking for divestment. So Divestment WPI is rebooting the divestment movement on their campus. Back in 2012, a small group of students started a divestment campaign, but it died out after 3 years of no response from administration. A lot has changed since then, thanks to the work of so many people who came before them. Now, WPI students are rebuilding the movement and calling on a new administration to divest. They've written up an open letter to the president that a few members will walk you through right now. And I'll also going to put into the chat a link to the actual letter. They made the letter a little bit more generalized, so different university groups can kind of use that as a mold for their own letter. They did really, it's a really great letter. I think a lot of university groups can benefit from going through it. So with that, I turn it over to the WPI folks.
Hi. Just to point out, Emma mentioned a petition that is circulating now. I think it was on the slide.
Yeah, I just totally forgot to say that, but we had a petition that's been going around for a couple of years, and if anybody's willing to sign it, that would be great.
Cool. Okay, I'm struggling with clicking here. There we go. Alrighty, so yeah, we wrote an open letter that we're planning to send to our school today, actually. And we're just gonna walk through it. It's a little bit on the long side, but like part of it is references because we just want it to be really thorough and well researched and, you know, reliable as a resource. The entire letter is basically just a list of counterpoints for all the possible arguments people might have for not wanting to divest. We've actually had a professor write an open letter like years ago saying why the school shouldn't divest. So there was some resistance a while ago, but a lot has changed. Anyway, so we started by addressing the letter to the president of our school and then the board of trustees, because those are the people who control the endowment. And then just right away, we said, you know, we want to divest in the first sentence. That's what we want from you. After that, we wanted to address kind of the elephant in the room and the fact that this recent health crisis has turned everything on its head. And, you know, divestment isn't going to happen right now, obviously, but we should consider using this as an opportunity. Like when we're rebuilding and recuperating from all this, we should really be considering more sustainable investments moving forward. We only took like one paragraph to talk about kind of the economic and human and social implications of having a climate crisis, because I don't know, for us, we felt like it was kind of common knowledge and we shouldn't dwell on it too long. Like we're not here to prove to you that climate change is a real thing. That wasn't the point. So we quickly moved on to sort of the science angle because we're a tech school, and as Emma did a really good job explaining, like different schools are going to have different angles and sort of missions and images that they can play to with their schools. So for us, it was more the tech sort of science angle. We're a STEM school. So we were quoting on the IPCC and then trying that back into how that relates to our school. So it's not just like a rant about climate change and economics. And then we moved on to why divestment is actually important and how it can make a difference, because there's always this question of like, if I divest, then won't someone else just buy up the stocks? And then it's like my loss, you know, evil was going to happen anyway. I might as well profit from it. But that's definitely not the point here. So we wanted to point that out as well. We also wanted to mention that like if you're funding fossil fuel companies now, you're kind of perpetuating the status quo because they're, you know, spreading misinformation and funding pro-carbon policies that are going to just continue our dependency on fossil fuels in the future. And then again, we want to tie it back in. So we talked about, you know, if you're funding fossil fuels, you are funding a carbon dependent future. And again, this is contradictory to everything schools are trying to teach us. And to point out that a bunch of institutions have already done this. We're not the first people to divest. We won't be the last, hopefully. This is a huge thing and it's only just getting started. So pointing out to your administration that like this could be good for their image, because you know schools are a company just like any other. They're trying to make money. They have customers, which are students, and they have an image to maintain, and they're competing with other schools. So if you point out that other schools are doing this too, hopefully that will pique their interest more and show them that it's not only possible, but that it's important and that students want this. So we wanted to point that out as well. And maybe we were kind of sassy when we wrote this, but we sort of threw their own words back in their face, because our school is always trying to teach us about, thinking globally and, taking responsibility for bettering society and all that stuff, this sort of responsibility to use your knowledge and point of power to help others. And they're definitely failing to do that in their investments. And yeah, we just close by saying, like, we get that this isn't going to happen overnight. So this is what we'd like to see. We'd like to see a plan, and we'd like to see open communication going forward. So, we'd like to start off with just a conversation. A civil conversation would be much better than having to run like a full-fledged campaign and demand transparency and have to fight for every single thing. So we wanted to start off on a kind of friendly, but also a very firm stance with clear demands. And we just signed it from DivestWPI because we didn't want to spend too long and like put off sending this letter and like collect all these signatures and stuff, but we're going to launch this as a petition and have people sign up online to sign the letter. Yeah, again, our focus was kind of the science angle, and just to customize this, as Emma mentioned, like try to appeal to your school's image and their mission. So if you have a particular role in the community, a particular thing that your school is supposed to be great at, like try to appeal to that. And then identifying your school's relationship with fossil fuels. We kind of picked on ExxonMobil a lot because our school has close ties with them. So that was our focus when we were naming companies. And yeah, as Andrew mentioned, this draft, this like template is posted online for anyone to use. And that's everything.
And I would just add that they have their own comments on the side that kind of walks through the letter again for you. So it's a really great letter. I'll post it again in case somebody didn't see it. It's a great tool to have if you're pushing for divestment on your campus. Claire, has the administration responded to the letter?
Oh, we haven't sent it yet. We're sending it tonight, like after this call, actually.
Oh, wow, awesome.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, you said you were a little sassy a little bit with the letter. I think that's okay. I think that's, you want to use the university's own mission statement and their own words against them, point out the hypocrisy of not divesting away from fossil fuels. So
they did a good job teaching us something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the letter is very well written. So again, if you're looking to start your own divestment campaign on your university, please use that as a tool. And just one quick note from our first presenters, if you're interested in learning more about Clark Climate Justice, please check out our Facebook at Clark Climate Justice. Also, if you want to reach out to any of the university groups, you're having trouble finding them, reach out to the Sunrise Worcester Gmail. So it's sunriseworcester@gmail.com, and we can help connect you with university divestment tools as well as different campus leaders. So from moving on now from university centered divestment campaigns, we're going to look at one in Somerville, Massachusetts. So this is going to be focused on a divestment campaign outside of universities. To give this talk, we have John Grossman. He's a lifetime labor activist and a volunteer for 350 Mass in Lowell. He currently works for the SEIU Local 509, a union of human service workers in Massachusetts. Local 509 is part of the Mass Divest Coalition. So with that, we're going to turn it over to John. John, thank you again for being on tonight.
Hi, everybody. Glad to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit about campaign to divest state public pension funds from fossil fuels in Massachusetts. Massachusetts has a lot of public employees, as whether they work for the state or for cities and towns. Most of them have pensions. The pension money is invested, and as taxpayers, we should have something to say about where that money is invested. As Bill McKibben put it, it makes no sense to pay for your retirement by investing in companies that guarantee you won't have a planet worth retiring on. So this is actually a story of two groups. One is called Mass Divest and the other is called Fossil Free Somerville. Mass Divest was started by people who were former or present state employees or teachers, because the teachers' money is the same place that state employees' money is, and were climate activists and wanted to work on divestment. Fossil Free Somerville was started by people who live in Somerville and wanted their town to divest their pension funds. So, don't worry, I won't try to explain the Massachusetts retirement system. But the things you have to know is that the state funds are invested by a group, are controlled by a group called PRIM, which is the Investment Management Board for state funds and teacher funds. And city and town funds are usually controlled by local retirement boards, such as the Worcester Retirement Board or other city and town retirement boards. And they're overseen by a state agency called PERAC, which oversees them. And by the way, let me recognize Janet Cason, who's in the meeting here, who also works with us in Mass Divest, volunteers with us in Mass Divest. So just want to point that out. So we had to analyze who makes the important decisions, who are we trying to influence? And I don't know why this is jumping along here. There, all right, come back. For the state funds, it's the PRIM board. And the PRIM board is the people that manage the funds or hire the managers, but the state legislature can influence them and can tell them what to do. They can pass a law and tell them what to do. Similarly, in municipalities and towns and cities, there are local retirement boards, but they have to pay attention to what the city councils and the mayors want them to do. Who are the stakeholders that we want to organize here? There's people who care about the climate crisis, like all of you. There are the taxpayers who fund our pensions, and public employees or retired public employees who either are receiving pensions or looking forward to it. And full disclosure, I'm one of those. Well, I was a public employee and intend to collect my retirement in the near future. So here's what happened. The Mass Divest group, focusing on state pension funds, filed bills 3 sessions in a row, and now we're into the 4th session. The state legislature has a 2-year session. And the first year, we started by filing a bill to divest state pension funds from fossil fuels over a 5-year period. That bill didn't get too far before the legislators said, well, it's not going to make it, but maybe something more easier to pass, something lighter could pass, such as a commission to make recommendations on divestment. Obviously, much less strong of a position to take, but the thought was if we could pass that, then the next year we could work on the results of that commission to get divestment passed. That didn't pass either. And over the 3 sessions in the 6 years, we filed both those bills, various versions of them, and they've gotten a certain ways down through the legislature. They weren't just immediately rejected, but we haven't got them into law yet. And I'll get into what happened this session in a minute. Fossil Free Somerville had more success. They had a 3-year campaign to get the Somerville Retirement Board to agree to divest. They did agree to do that. And what happened was PERAC, the state agency that oversees it, said, no, you can't do that. That's illegal. The only way you can do that is if the legislature gives you permission. That was quite a frustration for them. So the result of that was that we merged. The 2 groups got together because the Somerville group said, well, we need to focus on the state legislature now. We have no choice. And the state group needed all the help we could get. So we're merged together on this. And we got a new bill filed in the recent session that started in 2019 called the Local Option Divestment Bill. which that bill would allow any local system, any city or town municipal system, such as Somerville or Worcester for that matter, to divest if they chose to. It didn't require anybody, it doesn't require anyone to divest. It just gives you the opportunity. And we filed a bill to divest the state pension funds as we had in the previous year. The divestment bill isn't going anywhere. The local option bill still has a chance as we move in towards the final stretch run of the session. We've taken over the years a variety of different types of actions, as you might imagine, of all the usual kinds that people do: lobby days, testifying at public hearings with experts, rallies, press conferences, guerrilla theater, all sorts of stuff. This is what Fossil Free Somerville did. That's sort of their timeline. We don't really have time to get into it, but you can see that they screened films, got petitions, signatures, held informational events, letters to the editor, march and rally, and they did convince the retirement board to vote in favor of divestment. And Mass Divest, more focused on the legislature, but we did have our rallies, and we had the Billionaires Bash where we criticized Prim. One interesting development was trying to get Prim to agree to divest, but they made it pretty clear every time we approached them publicly that they would only do what the legislature told them to do, and otherwise it was capitalism full speed ahead at all costs. Here's some pictures. Testifying doesn't really make for great pictures. That was our Billionaires Bash. We had to learn a lot of stuff being a volunteer group. We had to learn how the retirement system works, how investing works. We've heard talk today about direct and indirect investments and those kind of problems. The legislative process, that's the biggest thing that we have to figure out. And the politics involved with that. As you may know, the legislature doesn't simply sit there and take votes, but there's a power structure within the legislature, and there's a lot of egos, and there are ways you have to learn how to talk to folks up there if you want them to do something. We organized groups as we built a coalition of climate. We started with climate action groups who started it. Other environmental groups joined in, and faith organizations, and then public employee unions joined. And that made a big difference in terms of our clout with the legislature. And of course, concerned individuals who sort of form the backbone of the people who make this thing happen. And we do our tabling and organizing just as everybody else does as we can. The main arguments that we've made, the moral, what we call the moral argument, which everybody is talking about today. Climate crisis is bad, so investing in it is bad. And the financial argument. Fossil fuels are not doing too well, and they're bad investments. So why don't we get out before they become stranded assets? And never mind the cost of paying for the impact of climate change, which the government's going to have to do. They're doing it already. And the interesting interplay between those two arguments, because they're different kinds of arguments. And the arguments that we've been hearing on the other side is, don't mess with people's retirement. It's fine to talk about nice principles, but people are counting on this money to survive, so don't mess with it. The slippery slope argument, which I imagine you get in university context as well. If we divest from fossil fuels, what are you going to ask us to divest from next? Could it be private prisons? Could it be guns? Could it be Israel, Palestine? Could it be military? And there are bills about all these things at the State House. And finally, a powerful argument that we really have to fight hard against is, if fossil fuels are such bad investment, as you say, why aren't the professional investors divesting? After all, who would you rather take financial advice from? A wealthy professional investor with an MBA or a union organizer? So briefly, these are the challenges that we're facing. The coalition challenge. When you have a coalition, organizations will endorse your issue, but that doesn't mean they will make it a priority. And organizations that have business at the State House have their priorities, and it's hard to get in that list. And if you're not in that list, how much help are you really going to get from the organization? another challenge that we have is the volunteer challenge. Should we try to create, this thing has been going on for 6 or 8 years. Do we need to raise money and hire staff to do all the work, or can we handle it on an individual volunteer basis? Nobody wants to spend time fundraising, but on the other hand, people do burn out, and if you have money, you can pay somebody who might know a little more about it. The strategy challenge is fascinating. How much time and energy do you spend on the inside baseball at the State House of finding the right people to talk to, who can carry your legislation, who knows who and where, and how can we make it happen, and what compromises do we need to make? On the other hand, how much time do you spend organizing the general public to jump up and down and demand divestment and try to force the state legislature to do something? And this is similar to the theory of change challenge. I've noticed that a lot of climate justice activists, at least at the beginning, or especially the environmentalists, think that all you have to do is go up to the State House and explain all the facts to the legislators, and they'll see that this is obviously the right thing to do. And as we're all learning, it doesn't work like that. What works with politicians is political pressure. So how much time do you spend educating, and how much time do you work on getting political pressure on certain politicians to vote your way? And then, as I mentioned earlier, the other side of the slippery slope is the solidarity challenge. There are other groups fighting for divestment in the State House. Most of the members of our organization support most of what those groups are trying to do. Do we work with them, or do we there's a strong temptation to try to separate yourself from them, saying, look, I know a lot of people want to divest, but listen to our case, listen to our cause. We have a different argument, because it's very difficult to get the legislature to focus on 5 different divestment causes and to vote on all of them. So how can we stay together without sacrificing the opportunity to win? And how can we win without selling out the people that other people that we support? You also see this issue in a way with the climate groups. There's a lot of climate legislation now. Originally, divestment was one of the major issues for the climate movement. But as some of you have spoken about, we've moved on to some other issues. And the legislature has trouble doing more than one thing at one time, especially in one subject. And so they will say, well, we've already working on this climate issue about procuring wind energy, or we're hearing about from the carbon pricing people, and you've got this other issue, but the carbon pricing people aren't talking about your issue. And so organizing that and finding our place within the movement has been another challenge. And maybe if we could solve some of these challenges, we could get the bill passed. We're still working on it. And if anybody wants to join us, we meet every Thursday evening. You can call into the meeting. Well, now you have to call into the meeting. At some point in the future, it'll be an option. And that's how to get in touch with us. That's how to get in touch with me. And we'd love to work more with student groups. We haven't done as much of that as we would like to. Thank you.
Thanks, John, for coming on. I'm really glad that we had Fossil Free Somerville on, because I think it highlights that some of the challenges that you face are the same ones that are being faced at universities. So it kind of gives the idea like that you all are in it together, and I think collaboration is the biggest way to combat those challenges. So thank you again for coming on tonight. We really appreciate hearing Fossil Free Somerville's story. From here, we're going to move away from actual divestment campaigns, and we're going to hear a presentation from the Union of Concerned Scientists. This is going to be focused on targeted divestment, as well as some of the disinformation campaigns used by the fossil fuel industry. The first speaker from UCS is Natalie Hurd. Natalie Hurd is an outreach and research associate for the Union of Concerned Scientists Fossil Fuel Accountability Campaign. She has been with the team for over 2 years and works out of the Washington, D.C. office. Before joining UCS, Natalie was an AmeriCorps member in Nashville and a student organizer as an undergraduate at the College of William and Mary in Virginia. Her work focuses on corporate accountability and environmental policy. Second, Ortel Ullman is a senior campaign coordinator with UCS's fossil fuel accountability campaign. So Natalie and Ortel, thank you for coming on tonight. And the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. I'm Natalie, and thank you to all the speakers earlier. It's been so great to hear your lessons learned from divestment campaigns. I worked on one in college as well, and it's actually what brought me to UCS. So this has been great. I'm going to get us started off today by speaking about past and current fossil fuel company deception on climate change. And then I'll introduce a tool we can use to hold these companies accountable, climate attribution science. And after that, Ortal will talk about avenues of change, including targeted divestment. All right, so in the past, when politicians and activists have talked about responsibility for climate change, much of the focus has been on countries' responsibility. We saw this in the frameworks used for international climate negotiations like the Paris Agreement. However, it's important to look at non-state actors, particularly fossil fuel producers. Like these. So landmark research by Richard Heady at the Climate Accountability Institute in 2014 looked at the carbon emissions of these companies. His research found that nearly 2/3 of all industrial carbon emissions, starting from the Industrial Revolution onward, can be traced to just 90 carbon producers, including companies like ExxonMobil, BP, Chevron, and Shell. So in this graph, you can see the blue is global emissions from fossil fuels, and the red is the top 90 carbon producers. Though the Industrial Revolution began more than 250 years ago, more than 60% of all industrial carbon emissions have been released only since 1980. So that 1980 number is that darker orange in that graph. So this is a notable date because documents show that in 1980, the nation's largest oil companies were monitoring climate research. And this is actually an outdated slide. We now know that from more recent research that the oil industry knew about the harm of its products as far back as the 1960s. All right, so in 2015, UCS compiled evidence of fossil fuel industry knowledge and deception about climate change in the climate deception dossiers. The sources reveal the direct hand of ExxonMobil, Chevron, Shell, BP, and others in creating an atmosphere of doubt and denial around climate change, obstructing policy action that could have benefited the health of people and the planet. In the dossiers, we looked at decades of disinformation by the fossil fuel industry and their trade associations. For example, the American Petroleum Institute, together with the nation's largest oil companies, ran a task force to monitor and share climate research between 1979 and 1983. This is a picture of a 1998 API memo that says victory will be achieved when average citizens' recognition of uncertainties in climate science becomes part of the conventional wisdom. Keep in mind, this was from 1998, but API is still very active in opposing US climate policy. We'll talk about that later. And major oil and gas companies like ExxonMobil and Chevron continue to fund and hold leadership positions in this group. One study published in 2017 found that ExxonMobil promoted misleading views of climate change that didn't even align with their own research. In the late 80s, Exxon cut back its CO2 research and began working at the forefront of climate denial. ExxonMobil placed ads made to look like articles in the New York Times, pictured on the right, from 1989 to 2004 that promoted doubt, just as laid out in the API memo, to fabricate uncertainty about climate science. While the study only looked at ExxonMobil, we do know that the entire industry was aware of this science. For example, Shell produced an educational film for public viewing, distributed to schools, about the imminent dangers of global warming in 1991, acknowledging that action now is the only safe assurance. But in the years following, they spent many millions of dollars lobbying against climate policies. And the disinformation continues to this day. While more subtle on their websites and financial disclosures, companies are continuing to use language that downplays the effects and causes of climate change. And when you look at their social media, like the posts here, these companies almost look like green energy companies. But we know this isn't the case. it's just greenwashing. At the rate BP is investing in solar, it would take more than 2 decades to match its 2018 spending on oil and gas. And that's just an example from one company. And also in 2018, BP spent $13 million opposing a carbon fee in Washington state, even though they say that they do support a carbon tax. In fact, the oil industry, which promotes the idea of a carbon fee pretty often, spent $28 million to oppose this one state's ballot measure. As another example, this year, both BP and Shell have made net zero 2050 pledges, but both companies have yet to reveal a plan on how they will actually get there. And the plans that they have disclosed fall significantly short of achieving net zero by 2050. This is one fun example of someone calling out BP's greenwashing on Twitter. So if you ever see an oil company saying something like this, feel free to respond with something sassy like that. Okay, so now that we know this, how do we hold fossil fuel companies accountable for decades of deception? One tool we can use is climate attribution science. And with this, we can see what the effect of their decades of climate deception and lobbying really has been. The science of climate attribution can quantify how much climate change is contributing to more extreme weather, like extreme heat, drought, and more frequent and stronger storms and flooding. Paired with Richard Heady's research tracing the amount of emissions that each company is responsible for, this allows scientists to then quantify exactly how much these companies contributed to these climate impacts. Understanding the impacts of their emissions takes on new meaning when we remember that this orange part of the graph all happened after companies chose to continue to emit and spread disinformation after they knew about the dangers of their product. UCS climate scientist Brenda Eckwurzel, along with colleagues, ran a climate model with those data to find the amount of global temperature rise and sea level rise that were tied to the emissions from the 90 carbon producers that Richard Heady looked at. They found that emissions from just those 90 companies contributed to about half of total global temperature rise since the Industrial Revolution. They also found that those companies contributed nearly 30% of global sea level rise. We can also look at findings for emissions over the time period when companies knew about the harm of their product. This paper pulled out 50 investor-owned carbon producers, meaning companies like ExxonMobil and Chevron that your pension or school might be invested in. And it was able to tie the emissions of these 50 companies to sea level rise equal to the amount of water it would take to cover the entire US up to 1 foot. And we could narrow it down even further to these 6 companies shown here: Chevron, ExxonMobil, Shell, Peabody Coal, BP, and ConocoPhillips. It would take Niagara Falls flowing more than 18 years to equal the amount of sea level rise brought by only these 6 energy producers since 1980, since the time they knew. So think about how different the world would be if these companies had acted on the science they knew to be true and not spread disinformation. With this in mind, UCS considered what society should expect responsible companies to do now. We believe companies should renounce disinformation on climate science and policy, plan for a world free from carbon pollution, support fair and effective climate policies, fully disclose climate risks, and pay their fair share of climate damage and adaptation costs. We looked at how company statements and actions measured up to our expectations in a report we called the Climate Accountability Scorecard. And we looked at these 8 companies, which are all top publicly owned producers. Our 2018 scorecard found that some companies have taken steps to distance themselves from anti-climate messages and bowed to shareholder pressure to acknowledge climate change in their business planning. But their actions overall remain insufficient to prevent the worst effects of climate change. None of these companies have demonstrated a level of ambition consistent with keeping global temperature rise within the Paris Climate Agreement limits, and many downplay or misrepresent climate science, and all continue to spread climate disinformation through trade and industry groups. So a lot of this disinformation has been disseminated by groups like the American Petroleum Institute, the National Association of Manufacturers, the US Chamber of Commerce, all of which have lobbied against climate-friendly policies like Washington State's carbon price and the EPA's methane regulations. In fact, API has used the coronavirus as an excuse to lobby the EPA to lift health and safety regulations at oil and gas operations, opening already vulnerable communities up to further pollution of their air and water without government oversight. These groups make it easier for fossil fuel companies to say one thing and do another. For example, they might make a statement supporting the Paris Agreement, but secretly funnel money to trade associations lobbying against the Paris Agreement. Next, we'll hear from Ortal, who will talk about taking action.
Thanks, Natalie. So we just learned that fossil fuel companies knew that their product caused climate change decades ago and have spent those decades since lying to the public and to policymakers. And we learned that they're continuing to influence legislation and public opinion by funding these industry groups to basically do their dirty work behind closed doors. So the question, of course, is what now? And that's what this whole last hour has been about. We think that there are lots of avenues for holding companies accountable. And while I'm not even going to attempt to cover everything tonight in the next few minutes, we wanted to highlight just a few ways that UCS is pursuing change, including one form of divestment. So one way that UCS approaches change is the so-called inside game, working to influence how investors are communicating their expectations of climate action to fossil fuel companies. So investor pressure to take climate action has been heating up over the last few years, and that sends strong signals from the company's owners, the investors themselves, about the importance and urgency of their role in the crisis. Another avenue is through legal pressure. Our science and analysis that Natalie just ran through has supported over a dozen state and local governments, and even another industry, the fishing industry, in filing lawsuits against these fossil fuel companies. So these lawsuits are based in everything we just talked about, based in the fact that the very companies responsible for the climate impacts we're seeing now are leaving taxpayers, us, to deal with the costs of those impacts. So the people now having to deal with the rising costs of climate change are suing fossil fuel companies to pay their fair share of those climate damages. And then, of course, really importantly, there's activist pressure. So for tonight, I'm just going to highlight divestment and specifically the strategy of targeted divestment. So we believe that universities and other organizations, including UCS, should invest their money in line with their values. And while for a lot of institutions, that's going to mean divesting from fossil fuel entirely, some are choosing to divest specifically from companies that take or don't take specific action. So tools like our climate accountability scorecard that Natalie highlighted earlier help create differentiation between companies. And by creating that differentiation, we can incentivize companies to compete with each other by taking more ambitious climate action. So just to give one example, Barnard College, students at Barnard recently won their divestment campaign, and they worked with the administration to divest from fossil fuel companies specifically that deny climate science. So the Barnard Divestment Task Force of students and administrators worked together to create a framework for divestment based on the same kinds of metrics we used in our scorecard mentioned earlier. And why did this work, right? They chose to divest from companies that spread climate science disinformation because as an academic institution, they see this action as obviously being totally opposed to their mission. So it made sense for an institution like that to differentiate between companies based on their climate science communications. So differentiation is important because it pushes companies to do better, to not spread climate denial and deception in this case, because they care about their public image. No company wants to be named on a bad guys list, especially if their main competitors are not feeling the same heat. So a very recent example that Natalie reminded me of earlier today was that when BP first came out with their net zero plan, that is not really a net zero plan, this was a few weeks ago, a top Shell executive said he didn't see the need to get into an arms race of carbon dioxide targets, signaling that Shell was not going to be coming out with their own net zero plan. And yet, last week, Shell released their new net zero plan. Neither plan is complete, neither plan is sufficient, but it's a great example of how important public image is to these companies. And each new commitment gives activists more of a platform to demand that the companies stand by their commitments. So we've been excited that our resources have helped campaigns for targeted divestment, creating these corporate competitions that give us more fodder to hold them accountable. And of course, we also think that the research that we've done on fossil fuel company deception and responsibility can support campaigns for full divestment as well and make all those same arguments. And of course, we know that those campaigns are increasingly winning at small and large institutions alike. So what's next? Of course, we hope you'll take energy from this Earth Day and this evening and look for opportunities to pressure institutions that you're involved with to align their own investments with their values. And we welcome you to reach out to us for resources in that long-term work. And of course, know, as you've seen throughout the day, that there are many others at the forefront of divestment campaigning who can help you as well. And if you want to take a quick action right now against disinformation, you can go to the link on the screen, which I think Natalie can drop into the chat box as well, where we have a super quick action pressuring BP and Shell to leave the American Petroleum Institute, the lobby group that you've heard about a few times tonight. So API continues to lobby for policies that harm our health and safety. And while BP and Shell have pledged publicly to align their lobbying with climate goals, they both still lead and fund API. And so with API's recent actions to roll back pollution regulations during the coronavirus pandemic, we think it's the perfect time to pressure them. And it's high time for BP and Shell to cut ties with this group. So the link on the screen here now, just our website, ucsusa.org/theyknew, nice, easy, short link will take you to our main fossil fuel company accountability campaign page, where you can find all the resources we talked about tonight and many more. And feel free to reach out to Natalie or I over email if you want to get more involved in any of our work. And I'll pass it back to Sunrise. Thanks so much for organizing.
Thank you, UCS, for presenting tonight. I just want to point out to everybody that it is past 8 o'clock. So if you have to go, thank you for stopping by. Before you do go, though, I'm going to post a slideshow into the chat. This is from Dennis Mahoney of 350 Central Mass. It's a quick introduction on Stop the Money Pipeline. It also points out certain financial institutions to withdraw your money from or avoid in the Worcester community, and different credit unions to go to instead. So thank you, Dennis, for creating that slideshow. I think it's a great tool to have for people. Following that, I just ask if you have not signed in yet to please go ahead and do that. I'm putting that link into the chat as well. It just gives us an idea of who's coming to these events. Yeah, so thank you again, everybody, for coming on. If you guys, I'm going to open up the floor for some Q&A. If anybody has questions, please, you can unmute yourself and talk, or just type it in the chat. While we're waiting for that, I just want to point out tomorrow we have 2 more live streams that are going to be focused on voting and political action. We have great local politicians coming on to the streams, as well as great actions to perform. So please find the time to go to both of these live streams. It's going to be a great day.
I have a question for Holy Cross and Clark. For those of you who are underclassmen and have seen other students graduate who were previously involved in divestment, what would be useful for you? Because like I'm a graduating senior and I'll be leaving the divestment movement on my campus. So what would be most useful for those graduating students to pass on before leaving?
Sorry, I think for us, we have some really, really strong, great leaders who are actually seniors this year and will be moving on in our campaign. And I think something that I really, really admire in them is like their ability to like take a step back and really like help freshman students and newer students to be leaders. And so we have like a lot of different things that we do in our meeting structure to sort of facilitate that. Like we have different people lead our meetings every week, and we have many different like subcommittees where a lot of times it will be like a freshman student or only freshmen that are leading that. So we just have like a lot of student leaders and a very horizontal sort of like power structure. And I'm sure that takes like a long time to establish, but I think something, yeah, that I admire in the senior students who are leaving is just their great ability to trust and like pass off sort of tasks to younger students.
Yeah, and I would echo everything Emily just said. And something that was really cool that we were able to do this year, we've been fighting to get a like sustainability director for the last like 4 years. And it finally happened this year, and we hired a full-time staff member. And so, I mean, I think that's a really good smaller campaign that schools can do, to have somebody who is able to kind of provide resources to the administration, and but also to students, so that they know like the history of kind of what is happening on their campus. And that's definitely one of the greatest things that we've done this year, just in terms of climate justice overall. But I would also just echo everything Emily said, and make sure that you identify like people that you can tell that are like really passionate, and just kind of grab them and be like, okay, so here you go. Right now though, my biggest struggle is definitely finding people who are interested in divestment work, because it is a different beast, because it is so research based and administrator based, and it's just like a different type of climate justice. So I'm just trying to find people who I think will want to take that on as a campaign.
Awesome. I just want to thank everyone again for coming on tonight. We're going to have this live stream is going to be posted to our Facebook account as well as our YouTube account. If anybody has any other questions for people, feel free to reach out to sunriseworcester@gmail.com. We can help you connect with each of the groups that talked tonight. And again, please come on to the live stream tomorrow. We're going to have a great event tomorrow as well. So thank you everybody that contributed to making the Divestment Day happen. It was a long process and turned out great. So thank you all again very much. I hope you guys have a good night.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Lucy.
And feel free to
Namaste.
reach out to me on Facebook too. It's Heidi J. Viertaler.
Yes, we will, Heidi.
Okay.
But you can stop the live stream so we don't forget this time.
Yes, good call.
Hey, Janet, thank you for connecting us with John.